Margaret Williams never expected her life to take such an unusual turn when she inherited her grandfather's sprawling cattle ranch in Montana. At 32, she had been working as a schoolteacher in the city, but the economic downturn of the early 1930s left her with few options. The ranch, though beautiful with its rolling hills and vast grasslands, came with overwhelming debt and the challenge of managing hundreds of cattle alone. The harsh winter of 1934 was particularly brutal. Snow piled high against the ranch house. Windows and the bitter cold made daily chores nearly impossible. Margaret struggled to keep the cattle fed and the water troughs from freezing. Her nearest neighbors lived 20 miles away, and the telephone lines had been down for weeks due to ice storms. She felt completely isolated from the world. One evening in late February, as Margaret was preparing her meager dinner by the fireplace, she heard desperate knocking at her door. The sound was urgent and continuous, cutting through the howling wind outside. When she opened the heavy wooden door, she found 5 men standing on her porch, their faces red with cold and their clothes covered in snow. They looked exhausted and half frozen. The men introduced themselves quickly, their teeth chattering from the cold. There was Samuel, a traveling salesman whose car had broken down. Robert, a railroad worker who had missed his train. James, a wandering preacher seeking shelter. William, a former soldier looking for work. And Thomas, a young farmer whose horse had collapsed from exhaustion. Each had found themselves stranded in the blizzard with nowhere else to turn. Margaret's Christian upbringing and natural compassion wouldn't allow her to turn away fellow human beings in such desperate need. Despite having limited food and space, she welcomed all 5 men into her home. The ranch house was large enough with several spare bedrooms that hadn't been used since her grandfather's time. She quickly set about preparing hot soup and coffee, while the men warmed themselves by the fire. As the storm raged outside for 3 more days, the men proved themselves helpful around the ranch. Samuel used his sales experience to organize the storage areas more efficiently. Robert applied his railroad skills to repair broken equipment. James offered spiritual comfort and led evening prayers. William used his military discipline to establish routines for daily chores. Thomas shared his farming knowledge to improve cattle care methods. Margaret found herself enjoying their company more than she had expected. For months, she had been lonely and overwhelmed by the responsibilities of running the ranch alone. These 5 men brought laughter, conversation, and practical help that she desperately needed. They shared stories around the fire each evening, creating a warm atmosphere that made the isolated ranch feel like a real home for the first time since her grandfather's death. When the storm finally cleared and the roads became passable again, Margaret faced a difficult decision. The men were preparing to leave and continue their separate journeys, but she realized how much she had come to depend on their help and companionship. The ranch was thriving with their assistance, and she dreaded returning to the loneliness and struggle of managing everything alone. That evening, as the men packed their few belongings, Margaret made a proposal that would change all their lives forever. She had been thinking about it for days, weighing the unconventional nature of her idea against her practical needs and growing emotional attachment to these 5 very different but helpful men. Margaret's hands trembled as she served the men their final breakfast together. She had rehearsed her words countless times during the sleepless night, but now that the moment had arrived, her courage wavered. The men chatted casually about their planned departures, unaware of the extraordinary proposition forming in her mind. After clearing the breakfast dishes, Margaret asked the men to gather in the living room. Her heart pounded as she stood before them, wringing her hands nervously. She began by expressing her gratitude for their help during the storm and acknowledged how much their presence had meant to her during those isolated winter months. Then she presented her unusual offer. The ranch needed permanent help to survive, she explained. She couldn't afford to hire workers, but she could offer partnership. Each man would receive an equal share in the ranch's ownership and profits in exchange for their continued work and commitment. But there was one condition that made her proposal truly extraordinary. She wanted to marry all 5 of them. The room fell silent. The men exchanged bewildered glances, certain they had misheard her. Margaret quickly explained that she had researched territorial laws and discovered that while uncommon, plural marriage arrangements existed in some remote areas where survival necessitated unconventional solutions. She emphasized that this would be a practical arrangement focused on mutual benefit and survival rather than romance. Samuel was the first to speak, his salesman's mind immediately grasping the business aspects of her proposal. He pointed out that the arrangement could indeed be mutually beneficial, as each man had skills that complemented the others. Robert nodded in agreement, noting that they had already proven they could work well together during the storm. James, the preacher, struggled with the moral implications, but acknowledged that desperate times sometimes required creative solutions. He suggested they could structure the arrangement as a cooperative community, with shared responsibilities, rather than focusing on the marriage aspect. William, ever practical from his military background, appreciated the strategic advantages of combining their different skills and resources. Thomas, the youngest of the group, admitted he had nowhere else to go and had grown fond of ranch life during their short stay. He had lost his own farm to debt and saw this as an opportunity to start over with people he had come to respect and trust. The discussion continued for hours as the men debated the practical, legal, and moral aspects of Margaret's proposal. They asked detailed questions about how the arrangement would work, what their individual responsibilities would be, and how decisions would be made. Margaret had thought through many of these details during her sleepless night and provided thoughtful answers. By evening, the men had reached a consensus. Each had his own reasons for accepting. Samuel saw a business opportunity. Robert craved stability after years of wandering. James viewed it as a ministry to help others. William appreciated the structure and purpose, and Thomas simply wanted a home and family. Margaret felt both relief and anxiety as they began planning their unusual future together. They agreed that their arrangement would be kept private from the outside world to avoid scandal and legal complications. To neighbors and visitors, they would present themselves as business partners running a cooperative ranch. The men decided to take different surnames to make the arrangement less obvious to outsiders. They would claim to be distant cousins who had inherited the ranch together. Margaret would keep her maiden name and present herself as the ranch manager. This deception would protect all of them from social judgment and potential legal problems. That night, they held a simple ceremony around the fireplace with James officiating. They exchanged handwritten vows promising to work together, support each other, and keep their arrangement confidential. Margaret felt a strange mixture of excitement and fear as she committed herself to this unprecedented lifestyle with 5 very different men. The first months of their unusual arrangement proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. Each man brought different expectations, work habits, and personalities that sometimes clashed despite their good intentions. Margaret found herself acting as mediator, while also learning to navigate her complex relationships with 5 very different husbands. Samuel's natural leadership tendencies often conflicted with William's military-style approach to organization. The 2 men disagreed on everything from cattle rotation schedules to financial planning. Robert preferred to work alone and grew frustrated with group decision-making processes, while Thomas felt overwhelmed by the more experienced men and doubted his contributions were valued. James struggled with his role as both spiritual advisor and equal partner in what he sometimes viewed as a morally questionable arrangement. He spent long hours in private prayer, seeking guidance and wrestling with his conscience. His obvious discomfort created tension during their evening discussions and decision-making sessions. Margaret realized that clear boundaries and defined roles were essential for their survival as a family unit. She called a meeting where they established specific responsibilities for each person based on their strengths and interests. Samuel would handle all financial matters and outside business dealings. Robert would manage equipment maintenance and infrastructure improvements. William would oversee daily ranch operations and cattle management. Thomas would focus on crops and food production. James would serve as mediator for conflicts and handle community relations. The division of labor helped reduce conflicts, but personal relationships remained complicated. Margaret had to learn to balance her attention and affection among 5 men with different emotional needs. Some evenings she spent with Samuel discussing business plans. Other nights she helped Thomas with his reading, and she made time for long walks with Robert, who valued quiet companionship. Their sleeping arrangements required careful scheduling and consideration. Margaret had a large bedroom to herself, while the men occupied separate rooms throughout the house. She rotated, spending nights with different husbands, following a schedule they had agreed upon to ensure fairness and prevent jealousy. This aspect of their arrangement felt awkward initially, but they gradually developed comfortable routines. The ranch began to prosper under their combined efforts. Samuel's business acumen helped them negotiate better prices for their cattle and secure favorable credit terms. Robert's mechanical skills kept their equipment running smoothly and reduced expensive repair costs. William's organizational abilities improved their efficiency and productivity. Thomas's farming knowledge allowed them to grow more of their own food and reduce expenses. James's diplomatic nature helped them maintain good relationships with neighbors and suppliers. By autumn, they had paid off several outstanding debts and were showing their first profit in years. The success validated their decision to stay together, but it also brought new challenges as their prosperity attracted attention from the community. Neighbors began asking questions about their living situation and the sudden improvement in the ranch's fortunes. Margaret and the men had to be careful about their public appearances and stories. They claimed to be distant relatives who had pooled their resources to save the family ranch, but some locals remained suspicious of the arrangement. The town doctor visited one day to treat Robert's injured hand and commented on how well organized and harmonious their household seemed for a group of bachelors and a single woman. His observations made them realize they needed to be even more careful about maintaining their cover story. Despite these external pressures, their internal relationships continued to strengthen. Margaret found that she genuinely cared for each of her husbands in different ways. Samuel challenged her intellectually. Robert provided steady emotional support. William offered protection and security. Thomas brought joy and enthusiasm, and James gave spiritual guidance and wisdom. The men also developed strong friendships with each other, moving beyond their initial awkwardness to become a true brotherhood. They supported each other through personal struggles and celebrated shared successes. Their unusual family had become something none of them had expected, a source of genuine happiness and fulfillment. As winter approached again, they prepared for their second year together with confidence and optimism. They had survived their first major test as a family and were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their unconventional arrangement had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than any of them had imagined possible. The second winter brought unexpected news that would test their family bonds in ways they had never anticipated. Margaret discovered she was pregnant, and the father could be any of her 5 husbands. The revelation created a mixture of joy, anxiety, and practical concerns that dominated their household discussions for weeks. Each man reacted differently to the pregnancy announcement. Samuel immediately began calculating the financial implications and planning for the baby's future education and inheritance. Robert quietly started building a cradle and baby furniture, pouring his emotions into creating beautiful wooden pieces. William worried about protecting Margaret and the child from potential scandal or legal problems. Thomas expressed pure excitement about becoming a father and helping raise a child on the ranch. James spent extra time in prayer, seeking guidance about their responsibilities as parents in such an unusual situation. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the complex emotions surrounding her pregnancy. She loved all 5 men in different ways, and couldn't bear the thought of one being favored over the others because of biology. She made it clear that regardless of which man was the biological father, all 5 would be equal parents to the child. The baby would know all of them as fathers, and would never be told who contributed the genetic material. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring, with each man taking special care of Margaret's health and comfort. Samuel arranged for the best medical care available, traveling to the nearest city to consult with doctors. Robert modified furniture and ranch equipment to make things easier for her. William took over her heavier chores and insisted she rest more. Thomas grew extra vegetables and herbs for her nutrition and prepared special meals. James provided emotional and spiritual support during her moments of doubt or fear. Their neighbors began to notice Margaret's condition and asked pointed questions about marriage and the baby's father. The family's cover story became more complicated, as they had to explain Margaret's pregnancy without revealing their true arrangement. They decided to tell people that Margaret had secretly married one of her cousins, but preferred to keep the details private due to family complications. As Margaret's due date approached, they faced the practical challenge of childbirth in their remote location. The nearest doctor was hours away, and winter weather could make travel impossible. James, despite his discomfort with their arrangement, proved invaluable during this time. His experience ministering to families in remote areas included assisting with difficult births, and he studied medical texts to prepare for any complications. The baby arrived on a snowy February night exactly 2 years after the men had first sought shelter at the ranch. Margaret's labor was long and difficult, but with James serving as midwife and the other men providing support, she safely delivered a healthy son. The moment they heard the baby's first cry, all 5 men were overcome with emotion, realizing they had truly become a family. They named the boy Daniel, meaning, God has judged, reflecting James's influence and their belief that their unusual arrangement had been blessed despite its unconventional nature. From the moment of his birth, Daniel was surrounded by 5 devoted fathers who each contributed to his care in their own way. Samuel established a trust fund for Daniel's education and future, carefully documenting his legal status as the heir to all 5 men's shares in the ranch. Robert crafted toys and furniture scaled perfectly for a growing child. William taught Daniel about ranch work and responsibility from an early age. Thomas shared his love of growing things, showing the boy how to tend gardens and care for animals. James provided moral guidance and taught Daniel to read using Bible stories and prayer books. Margaret marveled at how naturally the men adapted to fatherhood. None of them had biological children before, yet they each brought unique strengths to parenting. Daniel thrived under their collective attention and care, developing a confident and curious personality that reflected the best qualities of all his fathers. The baby's presence transformed their household dynamics in unexpected ways. The men became more cooperative and less competitive as they united in their devotion to Daniel and Margaret. Their evening discussion shifted from business matters to parenting concerns and plans for the boy's future. The ranch prospered even more as they worked harder than ever to secure their family's financial stability. Neighbors' suspicions were somewhat allayed by the baby's arrival, as it provided a more conventional explanation for the household arrangement. People assumed Margaret had married one of her cousins, and the others were helping raise the child as extended family. This explanation felt more socially acceptable and reduced the scrutiny they had been facing. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, it became clear that he would never lack for love, guidance, or opportunity. His 5 fathers competed good-naturedly to be his favorite, each teaching him different skills and values. Margaret watched with satisfaction as her unconventional family evolved into something beautiful and functional that exceeded all her original hopes and dreams. As Daniel grew into a bright and energetic 5-year-old, their carefully constructed world faced its greatest threat yet. A new sheriff had been elected in the county, a man named Harrison who was determined to clean up what he saw as moral corruption in remote areas. He had heard rumors about the Williams Ranch and arrived unannounced one autumn morning with 2 deputies and a stern expression. Margaret's heart raced as she watched the sheriff's car approach the ranch house. The men were scattered across the property doing their daily work, and she had no way to warn them quickly. She composed herself and greeted the sheriff with polite but cautious hospitality, inviting him inside for coffee while trying to assess the purpose of his visit. Sheriff Harrison wasted no time getting to his point. He had received reports about irregularities in the household arrangements at the ranch and was investigating potential violations of state marriage laws. He questioned Margaret about her relationship with the 5 men and demanded to see marriage, certificates, and legal documents proving their family status. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to maintain their cover story while avoiding outright lies that could lead to perjury charges. She explained that the men were distant relatives who had helped save the family ranch, and that she had married one of them in a private ceremony. When pressed for specifics about which man was her husband, she claimed family complications made the details private and sensitive. The sheriff was not satisfied with her evasive answers and demanded to interview each of the men separately. As they gathered in the living room, Margaret could see the tension and fear in their faces. Daniel, sensing the adult's anxiety, clung to Thomas and watched the strangers with wide, worried eyes. Samuel, with his smooth talking abilities, took the lead in dealing with the sheriff. He presented their business partnership documents and financial records, emphasizing their successful cooperative arrangement and respectable community standing. Robert remained mostly silent, letting his work-worn hands and honest demeanor speak for his character. William answered questions with military precision, providing brief factual responses that revealed nothing compromising. Thomas, the youngest and most nervous, struggled to maintain consistency with their story under questioning. His hesitation and stammering aroused the sheriff's suspicions, and Harrison pressed him harder about the sleeping arrangements and family dynamics. James, drawing on his preaching experience, spoke eloquently about Christian charity and the importance of helping family members in times of need. The interrogation continued for hours as the sheriff tried to find contradictions in their stories. He examined their bedrooms, looking for evidence of their true living arrangements. He questioned Daniel about his daddy, but the confused child only knew that all 5 men were his father's and couldn't understand why the stranger wanted him to choose just one. Sheriff Harrison finally departed with warnings that he would be investigating further and expected to see proper documentation of Margaret's marriage during his next visit. He made it clear that he suspected illegal cohabitation and would pursue charges if he found evidence of their true arrangement. That evening, the family held an emergency meeting to discuss their options. They realized their secret life was no longer sustainable and they needed to make difficult decisions about their future. Some neighbors had apparently grown suspicious enough to contact authorities, and they could no longer count on their isolation for protection. Samuel suggested they could relocate to a more remote territory where questions would be less likely, and enforcement of marriage laws was minimal. Robert proposed that they could dissolve their arrangement and go their separate ways to protect everyone from legal consequences. William recommended they prepare to fight any charges legally while maintaining their innocence of wrongdoing. Thomas, devastated at the thought of losing his family, broke down crying and begged them to find a way to stay together. James, torn between his moral concerns and his love for the family, suggested they could legitimize their situation by having Margaret divorce her husband and remarry someone else, then repeat the process to create legal documentation of her relationships. Margaret listened to their debates with growing despair. She had created this family through determination and love, and now outside forces threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The thought of losing any of her husbands or seeing Daniel separated from his fathers was unbearable. As they discussed their limited options late into the night, Margaret realized that whatever they decided would require enormous sacrifices from all of them. Their peaceful, prosperous life was coming to an end, and they would have to choose between staying together illegally or separating to protect themselves from prosecution. The sheriff's investigation had set in motion events that would force them to confront the reality that their unconventional arrangement, however successful and loving, existed outside the boundaries of acceptable society. Their happiness had always depended on secrecy, and now that secrecy was rapidly disappearing, leaving them vulnerable and afraid for their future as a family. After weeks of anxious planning and heartbreaking discussions, Margaret and her 5 husbands made the painful decision to separate temporarily to avoid prosecution. They would sell the ranch quietly and relocate to different territories, maintaining their family connections through letters and occasional secret meetings until they could find a permanent solution. The hardest part was explaining to Daniel why his family had to split up. They told him it was like a long adventure where everyone would explore different places but still love each other just as much. The 5-year-old didn't fully understand, but he sensed the sadness in his parents and tried to be brave for their sake. Samuel used his business connections to arrange the ranch sale privately, ensuring they received fair value without attracting attention from the sheriff's investigation. Robert spent his final weeks building portable furniture pieces that could be easily transported to their new locations. William organized their departure like a military operation, with detailed plans for communication and eventual reunion. Thomas preserved seeds from their garden and wrote down all their farming techniques to recreate their success elsewhere. James struggled with the moral implications of their deception, but ultimately chose family loyalty over social conformity. They decided Margaret and Daniel would travel to California where her aunt lived, providing cover for their move. Samuel would go to Denver to establish business connections and scout for opportunities. Robert planned to work on railroad construction in Colorado while staying in contact. William would travel to Wyoming where territorial law enforcement was minimal. Thomas would seek farm work in Oregon while looking for suitable land. James would continue his ministry work, traveling between territories and serving as their communication link. Their final night together was filled with tears, promises, and desperate hope that their separation would be temporary. They held Daniel close, each man whispering private words of love and encouragement to the confused child. Margaret tried to memorize every detail of their faces, uncertain when she would see them again. The departures began at dawn, with each man leaving at different times and taking separate routes to avoid suspicion. Samuel left first, kissing Margaret and Daniel goodbye with promises to write regularly. Robert followed an hour later, his usual stoic demeanor cracking as he hugged his son. William maintained his composure until the moment of departure when he broke down and had to be consoled by the others. Thomas cried openly as he held Daniel one last time, promising to send drawings and letters. James offered final prayers for their family's safety and eventual reunion before departing with heavy heart. Margaret and Daniel were the last to leave, taking a train to California 3 days later. As she watched the ranch disappear in the distance, Margaret wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by breaking up the most loving family she had ever known to comply with society's narrow definition of acceptable relationships. The first year of separation was agonizing for all of them. Letters traveled slowly between territories, and the constant fear of discovery made communication difficult. Margaret struggled to explain to her aunt why Daniel had nightmares and kept asking for his other daddies. The little boy's sadness broke her heart daily, and she began to question whether their sacrifice had been worth it. But their love proved stronger than distance and social pressure. Samuel established a successful business in Denver and began quietly purchasing land under different names in remote areas of Montana Territory. Robert saved money from his railroad work and contributed to their reunion fund. William found work managing cattle operations and learned about areas where unconventional families could live peacefully. Thomas worked various farms and gathered information about agricultural opportunities. James traveled extensively, identifying communities where tolerance and discretion were valued over strict social conformity. After 18 months of separation, Samuel wrote to announce he had found the perfect location, a remote valley in northern Montana Territory, where they could live as an extended family without scrutiny. The area was populated by other families who valued privacy and minded their own business. Local authorities were practical people, more concerned with crime prevention than marriage law enforcement. One by one, they began to gather at their new home. Samuel had purchased a large property with multiple buildings that could house their family, while maintaining the appearance of separate households. The reunion with Daniel was emotional and joyful, as the now 7-year-old boy rediscovered his father's and the family unity he had missed so desperately. They were older and wiser now, understanding the importance of discretion and the reality that their love existed outside society's approval. But they had also learned that their commitment to each other was stronger than external pressure. They established their new life more carefully, presenting themselves as business partners and distant relatives while privately maintaining their marriage bonds. Margaret reflected on their journey from that snowy night, when 5 strangers sought shelter to their current status as a reunited family. They had faced separation, legal threats, and social condemnation, but their love had endured. Daniel was growing into a confident, intelligent boy who understood that families come in many forms and that love, not law, defines true relationships. Their unconventional marriage had required enormous sacrifices and careful navigation of social expectations, but it had also provided them with a depth of love, support, and fulfillment that none of them could have found alone. As they began their new chapter in Montana Territory, They carried with them the knowledge that they had chosen love over convention and had emerged stronger for the experience.